My name is Janina Dill. I'm a professor of global security. Welcome to my exp. Nuclear weapons were created about 80 years ago, and they were used very immediately after their creation in August 1945, twice against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States, so in the closing days of the Second World War. And 80 years later, we want to explain why that is still the only time that nuclear weapons have been used in armed conflict. We now have 9 states in the international system that possess nuclear weapons that they could in principle use in armed conflict, and they haven't. The dominant explanation for why we have seen sort of 80 years of nuclear peace, in a sense, is deterrence. So the notion that states are deterred from using their nuclear weapons by the expectation that other states could then use nuclear weapons against them. Deterrence is really the dominant explanation for why we haven't seen the use of a nuclear weapon in armed conflict since 1945. But there is, in a sense, an alternative explanation, or a factor that some scholars argue we should also take into account, which is the idea of a nuclear taboo. So the notion that there's a strong moral prohibition on using nuclear weapons specifically, not of using them in particular ways, but simply prohibition on resorting to nuclear weapons. Now, a taboo is a particular kind of moral prohibition, one that we best can think of as categorical. So it's a prohibition that isn't sensitive to the expected consequences of doing or not doing something. Most of the time we have prohibitions, for instance, on using violence, but we think they can be overwritten if you have particularly good consequences. So if using violence is the lesser evil. Now, a taboo or a categorical prohibition is one where we would say we'll never do this, but certain types of acts are in a category that are so evil that we'll never contemplate doing them, even if we would have good consequences, or even if not doing them has really, really bad consequences. So a categorical prohibition is a prohibition of an act where kind of a lesser evil justification is not available. There are very few taboos kind of in real life that we generally admit exist, that are widely shared. Generally, the 2 examples people give of taboos are of incest and cannibalism, right? So these are acts that we think are in a category that's wrong, and even if we would think we get away with them, even if kind of not engaging in them might really have bad consequences, we tend to not contemplate engaging in these acts. And so one explanation that's out there for the non-use of force is that nuclear weapons are in that category, that there's a taboo against them. The political scientist who has most prominently argued this is a professor called Nina Tannenwald, who wrote a book in 2007 called The Nuclear Taboo. And she looks particularly at the United States, that had obviously as the first state to have nuclear weapons, and the state with one of the biggest arsenals of nuclear weapons had various junctures in its history where nuclear use might have been contemplated or might have even been an option. And she argues that we can't really explain the United States consistently opting against nuclear weapons use without this notion of a taboo. Now, of course, you could say, well, a taboo could be in principle something that only kind of elite political decision makers are subject to, right? They believe that it's categorically wrong to use nuclear weapons, but the societies around them don't necessarily believe that. But that would be quite surprising, because taboos they're such strong prohibitions that really for a person to buy into them, that's most likely if they kind of grow up in a population or a society that by and large considers something a taboo. Often taboos implicate kind of emotional disgust. And so it would be quite surprising if it were only American politicians who made decisions about nuclear use believe in that taboo. So one way in which we could test that theory of a nuclear taboo is to actually look at public opinion. And so my co-authors with whom I worked started basically by asking, is there a nuclear taboo in US public? Does the US public believe that it's categorically wrong to use nuclear weapon in all circumstances, regardless of the consequences, and may the heavens fall, right? That's really the idea of a taboo. And so they started this research program and didn't find it, my colleagues Scott Sagan and Ben Valentino. And I then at some point paired up with them to look at this more systematically and across different countries. And basically, wherever we looked, we didn't really find this taboo. Because what it would mean if countries believe in a nuclear taboo is that you can't tempt them with good consequences, right? That yes, by and large, we find that most people in most countries we looked at don't like nuclear weapons, right? They prefer to use conventional weapons. So if you give them a hypothetical scenario where they face a very significant threat and they have two options, they will, large majorities will say, let's use the conventional weapon. But then if you tempt them with consequences, with more effectiveness of nuclear weapons, then we find that majorities, particularly in the United States, France and Israel, are rather ready to endorse the use of nuclear weapons by their leaders if it promises better outcomes for them. And that's not really the structure of public opinion that we would expect if there was a nuclear taboo. There are some weapons that are outlawed by specific treaties. And there is a treaty that prohibits the use of nuclear weapons, which came into force in 2017. Unfortunately, none of the states that possess nuclear weapons have ratified the treaty, so by and large, they're not bound by that treaty. We don't have a prohibition specifically of nuclear weapons. The question then is whether you can use nuclear weapons in compliance with the principles that must be obeyed in all attacks, the principles of distinction, necessity, and proportionality. And that is contested to some extent. There are those who argue that you can come up with a case of a nuclear attack that complies with these principles, whereas others argue that, in fact, most cases that in which states would reasonably use a nuclear weapon, their use would violate the principles of distinction, necessity, and proportionality. If you fully appreciate the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons use, for instance, the risk of nuclear winter, but also simply the effects of nuclear exposure to the human body, then to me there's absolutely no doubt that the morally ideal solution to the problem of nuclear weapons is abolition. At the same time, advocating abolition right now is simply not particularly helpful, because unless you can get all countries to abolish their nuclear weapons, unilateral abolition or disarmament for just one or two nuclear-armed countries is potentially more dangerous, right, than what we have right now. So in the world we live in right now, we must engage in what a philosopher might call non-ideal theory. So what is the best possible outcome to work towards from the point where we find ourselves at, which is that we have nuclear weapons in the world, that it's several states that have them, 9 states altogether, with different regimes, different cultural backgrounds, and states that are involved in various conflicts and geopolitical tensions, and are therefore not likely to all give up their nuclear weapons. What is the kind of least worst outcome we can work towards from that point of view? And it's not an easy question, but I think we need multi-pronged strategy. And one of them is to educate publics in these countries about the consequences of nuclear use, right? So we find that their attitudes don't follow the logic of a categorical taboo. They don't think of nuclear weapons as evil per se, but they are ultimately sensitive to arguments about the consequences of nuclear use. So a public education campaign is one prong, and that is certainly a campaign that can't just focus on the United States, would have to focus on all nuclear weapon states. Institutionalization of safeguards against unwanted nuclear escalation or mistakes in communication would be another prong. And then, yes, a third prong is deterrence. If we know that nuclear weapons are in the hands of personalist autocrats like President Putin, who have certain incentives to potentially use nuclear weapons, then we must also take quite a hard-headed geopolitical view on this and say we must prevent a situation in which someone like President Putin would ever look at the world and say that it is a valid option for him to resort to the Russian nuclear arsenal. So we need really hard-headed geostrategic and geopolitical solutions. We must harness the power of moral argument and of law, and all of these things must come together to prevent the ultimate evil outcome, which would be nuclear use in the 21st century.